In 1985, the church told us 4 nuns vanished during a mission in northern Mexico. No bodies, no suspects, just silence. But my family never believed that was the full truth, because for nearly 40 years my grandmother lit 5 candles every year on June 15th. Not 4. 5. And last spring someone mailed me a letter with no return address, no explanation. Just a name we were never supposed to say out loud. The 5th sister wasn't missing. She was erased. Before we start, hit subscribe to help uncover stories they tried to bury, and make sure no name stays forgotten. My name's Lena Carter. I was born and raised in San Diego, and I'm 36 now. I grew up in a quiet 1-story home on the edge of National City, with a lemon tree in the backyard, and a grandmother who always kept the house smelling like cedar and polish. She was the last of the old Carters, the kind of woman who never missed a Sunday service, kept every receipt, and folded her grief into the pages of her Bible. My mother left California when I was 12 and never looked back, so it was always just the 2 of us after that. I moved away for grad school, got a place in Los Angeles. I wasn't planning to come back so soon, but when Grandma passed last March in her sleep, they said I was the only one left to sort through the house. The attic hadn't been touched since the 80s. I remembered it being full of holiday decorations and old keepsakes, but stepping up into that space after all those years, something felt different. Not just quiet, hollow, cleared out in a way that felt permanent. The first thing I saw was the crucifix still nailed above the entry beam, faded but still upright. The second thing was the scent old paper cedar wax, maybe. There was a trunk tucked behind some plastic Easter bins, cedar plain with a delicate brass latch, not decorative, not meant to be seen. It looked like the kind of box you weren't supposed to open unless someone gave you permission, but there was no one left to ask. Inside, wrapped in yellowing cloth, was a camera, an old Canon AE1. Next to it, a folded rosary, and under that, a cracked leather Bible with a ribbon stuck at Psalm 42. But what stopped me cold was a small envelope at the bottom. No address, no postage, just 4 words in heavy, slanted ink, for Celeste. I kept my promise. Celeste Carter was my aunt, my grandmother's oldest daughter. She was one of the 4 nuns who vanished in Mexico in 1985, the Mission 4, as the papers called them, for about 5 minutes before the news cycle moved on. I never met her. She was already gone by the time I was born, but her photo sat on the mantel my whole life. Her name was never said, but never forgotten either. I opened the envelope with shaking hands. It was a letter, handwritten, Spanish formal and careful. If you are reading this, then I did not come back, or I chose not to be found. But I kept my promise. There were 5, not 4. I saw everything. I carry it still. The writer didn't sign a name, just an initial. M. The next morning, I brought the letter to the parish office of St. Agnes in South Bay. They wouldn't let me see any records, said I wasn't press, but it didn't matter. Personnel files were off limits. Until I said her name. Celeste Carter. That changed something. They brought out a priest, older, thin, silver collar, cautious eyes. Said he remembered the sisters. All 4. But when I asked about a 5th woman, someone younger not on the official roster, he hesitated. Then he said quietly, there was a postulant. She wasn't counted. No papers. She wasn't supposed to go. But Sister Celeste vouched for her. I asked if she had a name. He said the others called her Maria, but he wasn't sure if that was real. Then he paused, looked at me for a long moment, and added, if she survived, she never came back. And the bishop told me not to file her name. That was the moment everything shifted. I'd come looking for answers, maybe even closure, but what I found instead was the beginning of something much heavier. That night, I returned to my grandmother's house and opened the Bible again. Stuffed between the spine and the back cover was a scrap of paper folded tight. One line, Maria was never supposed to be on the roster. And that's when I knew whoever she was, she didn't disappear by accident. She was left out on purpose, and someone was still trying to keep it that way. The parish office gave me more than I expected, but it still wasn't enough. Not yet. The man who confirmed her name, Maria, had been careful with his words like he was walking a tightrope between memory and consequence. He said she wasn't on the roster, that she didn't exist in the church's paperwork. But someone remembered her, and someone wrote that letter. I couldn't let it end there. I drove south the next morning down along the Pacific past Ensenada toward a stretch of coast where the hills fall into the sea like old stone shoulders. My grandmother's note had mentioned a place, the Sanctuary of the Broken Bells. I didn't know if it still stood or if it ever had, but it was the only lead I had. GPS cut out 20 minutes outside of town. The gravel road narrowed to a trail of dust and scrub winding between wildflowers and jagged cliffs. Eventually, I found a weathered arch choked in vines, and behind it, what was left of a mission. The sign was barely legible Sanctuary of the Broken Bells. Est, 1891. Abandoned, 1972. The white stucco walls had gone gray with salt and wind. One of the bells lay cracked in the weeds, green with rust. I stood there for a long minute before I knocked. Nothing. I tried again louder. Still silence. I turned to leave, and that's when I heard it. A scrape across stone, the slow groan of metal. The door creaked open. She looked older than I expected. Mid-60s maybe, with close-cut gray hair and wind-burned skin. She wore a blue scarf loosely knotted, and her eyes, sharp, watchful, tired, never left mine. I told her my name, that I was Celeste's niece, that I found her letter. Her gaze dropped to my wrist. I had wrapped my grandmother's rosary around it before I left. She saw it. That changed something. She stepped back without speaking and left the door open. Inside, the mission was clean but spare. Wooden beams, stone floor. A single candle burned near a crumbling altar. There was a cot in the corner, a mug on the table, and an old radio with exposed wires. I stood near the entrance and waited. She didn't sit, just stood by the window staring out at the sea. Her voice was soft when it finally came. She asked why I was there. I said I wanted the truth. Not the church's version, not what made the papers. Just what happened to the women in that mission. And to her. She closed her eyes for a moment, then opened them again. And then she said, "My name was never Pilar. It was Maria de Los Angeles." She turned toward me, and for the first time I saw the way she carried her body, careful, slightly tilted to one side. The limp was still there. She told me she joined the congregation in 1984. Her vows weren't official yet, but Sister Celeste believed in her. God calls the heart before the church files the paperwork, she said. That was how she ended up on the mission. Celeste had vouched for her. There were 5 of them. The others had names that were remembered Rosa, Amalia, Teresa. But Maria was never listed, never counted. She told me they were sent to assist a small orphanage near a town called El Mirador. It was supposed to be a 10-day trip, nothing political, just charity work. She paused and said the kids sang even when they were hungry. On the 5th night, armed men came, faces covered, guns drawn. They said the sisters weren't welcome, that they were spies. Foreigners bringing American religion into a war they didn't understand. The sisters prayed and waited. 3 nights later, they came back. Maria said it happened fast, shouting, glass breaking. Sister Rosa screamed. Someone hit her. When Maria woke up, she was tied to a post in the cellar. Celeste was there. Amalia, too. The others gone. She said Rosa had been taken. She thought she might already be dead. And Teresa. They'd come for her earlier that week. Maria stopped talking for a while then. Just stood by the window breathing like she was still in that room. She said Celeste never lost her calm, even when they beat her, even when they dragged her away. She kept singing hymns, whispering prayers. She believed it would pass, Maria said. That faith would hold. But it didn't. There was a storm one night, and the ropes were looser. Maria escaped. She tried to carry Celeste, but she was too weak. Celeste told her to go, told her if she stayed, they'd both die. So she ran. She ran until her lungs burned, found a local church. A priest helped her get across the border, and then she disappeared. I asked if she'd told anyone. She nodded. I tried, she said, but no one wanted the story. The police didn't press it. The church buried it. The press moved on. She had no legal name, no home, and too much guilt. The church said she was never there, that obedience meant not reopening wounds. She became a ghost. But she carried the others in prayer. Always. I opened my satchel and took out my grandmother's Bible, set it on the table between us, showed her the camera, the letter, the rosary. Her hands shook when she picked them up. She kept them, I said. All these years. She remembered. Maria sat. Her voice cracked. I failed her, she said. She saved me, and I went into hiding. You survived, I told her, and you left a trail. The room was quiet for a long time, just the wind against the wall, the sea below. Then she said, I'll tell you everything, but not to publish, to remember. I nodded. That night we lit candles in the chapel, one for each name, even the one she never expected to speak aloud again. The next morning she told me about the day they left for El Mirador. She said Celeste looked back at the border as they crossed. Like she already knew, Maria whispered. And then she said the words, I'll never forget. We weren't supposed to be there, and I wasn't supposed to survive. But she did. And now she was ready to speak. The recorder clicked on. Her voice was steady even as her hands trembled. I opened my notebook, flipped to a blank page, and wrote the only name that had never made the official list. Maria de Los Angeles, the fifth sister. And beside it, one question I still didn't have an answer to. Why now? Why had the truth waited until now to start coming undone? I didn't say it aloud, but I could feel it. Something else was waiting. Something we hadn't reached yet. Maria's story stayed with me long after I left the mission that night. It wasn't just the facts she gave me, it was the way she gave them. Like every word had waited years for permission. I recorded everything she was willing to share, and I wrote late into the night trying to preserve it exactly as she'd said it. But I knew I needed more. What happened to those women wasn't just a tragedy, it was a disappearance that was never investigated. And if Maria was telling the truth, then someone had decided it wasn't worth uncovering. I couldn't stop thinking about what the priest in South Bay said, the one who remembered Maria but never filed her name. He said the bishop told him not to. That silence would keep the scandal from spreading. I needed to know who else had followed those orders, who else had chosen to look away. That's how I ended up in Tijuana in a hospice not far from the border. The man I'd come to see was once a powerful figure in the diocese. His name was Father Jaime Cordova. He was in his 80s now, bedridden and not always lucid. I'd called ahead, told the nurse I was writing about the 1985 mission. She didn't ask many questions, just said, "He's not always clear, but maybe today's a good day." The room was small. Cool air, a crucifix above the bed, and a Bible on the nightstand with half a dozen bookmarks sticking out. When I stepped inside, he turned his head toward me slowly like he'd already been expecting someone. "You're the Ruiz girl," he said. His voice was thin but steady. "The one asking about the nuns." I nodded. He motioned for me to come closer. "She reached you, didn't she?" I asked who he meant, though I already knew. "Maria," he said. "I thought you might come. The past always finds its way back, especially when it shouldn't." I asked him why no one ever looked into the disappearances, why there was never a real investigation. He looked away from me, then toward the corner of the room and said, "They told me it was for the good of the church. That scandal wouldn't help anyone, that the world forgets women anyway." He gave a tired, bitter smile. But Celeste Ruiz, she didn't let herself be forgotten. Not in my conscience, not in my prayers. I asked if he knew there were 5 women, not 4. He closed his eyes for a moment. "Of course I knew," he whispered. "Maria was a child with the eyes of someone twice her age. I remember the limp, the way she tried not to take up space." He shifted slowly as if it hurt to move. "She survived," he said. "I got the report, quietly, from someone in the Mexican government. Said she crossed the border 2 weeks after the raid, but by then the orders had come down. From Mexico City, from Rome. She wasn't official, no record, no vow. She was a liability, not a martyr." I asked him plainly, "Did you erase her?" He didn't try to dodge the question, just said I obeyed. I told him that wasn't the same thing. He looked at me again, and his voice didn't shake. "No," he said. "It's not." There was a silence that settled between us then, not heavy but final, like something that had waited a long time to be spoken, and now that it had nothing else could be said. After a moment, he told me to check the drawer. I opened the top of the nightstand and found a small leather-bound book. The cover was cracked, the pages thick with handwritten notes and taped-in slips of paper. "A journal," he said. "My own. I kept what I could. Letters, memos, the names they wanted me to forget." I flipped through slowly. Some pages were prayers. Others were transcripts of internal meetings, clergy discussing the optics of the incident, weighing whether an investigation would make things worse. On one page, a single sentence stood out. "Sometimes obedience is the language of cowards." He said he wrote that after reading the letter Maria had sent him. "She begged me not to forget," he said. And I did. I told him it wasn't too late to help, that the story was still being written, that I didn't need his name, just his truth. He smiled faintly. "My name means nothing anymore," he said. I reached out, and he took my hand. His grip was weak, but he held it long enough to say, "You remind me of her. Celeste. She was fierce when she believed in something. I told him she never stopped believing, not even at the end. Then tell it all, he said. Don't let them vanish again." I promised him I would. As I left the room, he called out after me. I turned back. He looked smaller than he had before. "I'm sorry," he said. I asked him for what? For what I did. And for what I didn't do. I nodded. "I believe you," I said. "But your silence won't be the last word." That night I brought the journal back to the mission. Maria took it gently, turning it over like it might break. So he remembered she said. He remembered everything. We sat outside in the wind as the waves rolled below. She opened the book to the first page, read a few lines, and then closed it. "Will you publish it?" she asked. "Only if you want me to," I said. She was quiet for a while, then nodded. "But not for me," she said. "For them." A few days later, a shopkeeper in Baja pressed a photo into my hand. "Someone left this here," he said. "I think you should see it." 5 women sat on a bench outside a whitewashed chapel. 4 of them I knew, Celeste, Rosa, Amalia, Teresa. But the 5th, she was seated at the edge, turned slightly away, a scarf over her hair, her left leg bent inward, not smiling. But there. I brought it to Maria. She stopped when she saw it. "That was 2 days before we left," she said. "We were inspecting the chapel walls. I didn't want to be in the photo. I thought maybe if I stayed out of the pictures, they'd let me leave quietly." Her hand hovered over her own image. But I was always there, she said, just outside the frame of everything that mattered. I reached across the table, turned her hand over in mine. You mattered, I said. You still do. She gave a small nod, her eyes still on the photo. We were happy that day, she whispered. Even Celeste. She joked that we looked like saints on break. She didn't speak again for a long time after that, just stared out the window as the light began to fade. And when she finally stood, she lit a candle in the chapel. One for each of them. And for the first time since I arrived, she let the silence stay. But this time it didn't feel like hiding. It felt like remembering. Maria spoke more freely over the next few days, but never easily. She never sat for long. She moved about the mission with slow, steady purpose, folding linens, sweeping corners that hadn't gathered dust in years, lighting candles she didn't expect anyone to see. The routine kept her anchored, she said, gave shape to time that otherwise felt formless. I understood that. I was still sorting through what this story meant, what I was stepping into. What started with a locked trunk in my grandmother's attic had opened into something deeper, older, and still unfinished. Every night I returned to the same spot in the chapel where Maria prayed. I'd sit at the far end of the pews with my laptop open and a notebook beside me recording the pieces as she offered them. I didn't interrupt. I let her speak in her own time. There were still whole parts of her story she hadn't told, and I didn't push. But the silence between us started to feel less like a wall and more like shared ground. One morning she asked me what I believed. It wasn't an accusation, just a question. I said I wasn't sure anymore. That I believed in justice, maybe. In truth. In the importance of naming things that were buried. Maria nodded, but didn't answer. She looked toward the broken bell tower and said softly, Celeste believed truth mattered more than obedience. That's why she brought me. She didn't mean that literally, not just that Celeste vouched for her on that mission. She meant something deeper. Celeste believed that even someone not counted not official could still carry a sacred purpose. And Maria had carried it. Quietly. Alone. Later that evening, I found her in the adobe study off the chapel. She was kneeling in front of a low cabinet, sorting what looked like old altar cloths. The room smelled faintly of lemon oil and clay. I asked her if she remembered the day she crossed back over the border. She nodded without looking up. Said she was taken in by a former nun, someone named Sister Anne, who ran a small shelter for women along the Rio Grande. Maria said she told her the truth, or most of it, and the woman didn't ask questions, just made tea and said grief didn't keep time like the world did. She helped me disappear, Maria said, gave me a name no one would recognize, told me to go where I wouldn't be needed or missed. She said that with a kind of half smile, but there was no humor in it. And you chose this place, I asked. The mission. She stood slowly bracing herself on the cabinet. It chose me, she said. The church may have turned its back, but this is still sacred ground. I asked her if she was ever afraid someone would come looking. She nodded. Always. But I wasn't alone. I carried them with me. We fell into a rhythm after that. Mornings were quiet. Afternoons, she told me more fragments of life before the mission memories of the other women. Pieces of prayer she used to whisper when the nights were long. And at night, we sat together by candlelight while I transcribed everything I could. But the more I wrote, the heavier it all became. This wasn't just a story about what happened in 1985. It was about what was allowed to happen, what was silenced afterward, and what was still being carried by the one person left who refused to forget. One evening she mentioned a promise. Not the one from the letter, but something else. Something Celeste had asked of her before the end. I waited. She didn't speak for a long time. Then finally she said, Celeste told me not to speak unless I knew someone would listen. She looked at me and added, "I think she meant you." That night I stayed up late reading over my notes, listening to the soft wind rattle the old shutters. I kept thinking about how many people had walked away from this, how many had chosen not to look, how silence had spread like moss over every truth. But Maria stayed. She never left the memory behind. The next morning I returned to the chapel early before sunrise. The ocean was calm, just barely audible through the cracked stone walls. I brought the photograph with me, the one the shopkeeper in Baja had given me. I laid it on the pew beside her as she prayed. When she looked down and saw it, her hand froze mid-blessing. She stared at it a long time before touching the edge with her fingertips. "I forgot this day," she said quietly. "We were doing repairs on the chapel, 2 days before we left for El Mirador." I pointed to her figure at the edge of the frame. She wasn't looking at the camera. Her leg was turned slightly inward. Her scarf was pulled low. "I didn't want to be in the photo," she said. "I thought if I stayed out of the pictures, they might let me go quietly when it was over." She traced the image slowly, almost afraid to press too hard. "But I was always there," she whispered, "just outside the frame, always watching, always listening." She didn't say it for sympathy. It was just the truth. I asked her if she remembered what Celeste said that last day, the day she told Maria to run. She didn't answer right away. Then she looked toward the sea and said, "Tell them we prayed, that we didn't run, that our silence wasn't shame. It was survival." We sat there until the sun came through the window. Neither of us spoke. Not because there was nothing left to say, but because we both knew the hardest part was still coming. I had the testimony, the letters, the photo. But I needed something else. Something that could prove what the church had chosen not to record. Something that could speak even when everyone else stayed quiet. Maria must have sensed where my thoughts were heading. She turned to me and said, "There's one place I haven't gone back to. Not since I escaped. It's still there, though. I can feel it." I asked what she meant. She didn't answer. She just said, "If you really want to understand what happened, you'll need to see it yourself." And that was how I knew. The next step wasn't in the journals or the letters or even in Maria's memory. It was in what they left behind. And whatever it was, it hadn't been touched in almost 40 years. Maria didn't come with me when I returned to the convent in El Mirador. She stood at the edge of the mission's garden that morning, arms folded over her shawl, and said only, "You'll know where to look." I didn't ask her to explain. I could see in her face that going back, stepping inside that building again wasn't something she could do. Not yet. Maybe not ever. The drive inland was quiet, mostly 2-lane roads that narrowed the farther I got from the coast. The orphanage compound had long been absorbed by brush and erosion, but the convent still stood tucked behind a line of eucalyptus trees that hadn't been trimmed in years. It wasn't on any map anymore, and if I hadn't known what to look for, the worn sign nailed sideways to a post, the stone steps sunken under soil, I would have missed it entirely. The front door groaned open under my hand. Inside it smelled of dust and stone the way old buildings always do after decades of disuse. Light filtered in through warped window panes. Some of the furniture was still there, wooden benches, 2 narrow beds, a rusted stove, but most of it was broken or bent under the weight of time. I moved slowly, walking the perimeter of the main hall, stopping now and then to run my hand over the walls. The chapel was smaller than I'd imagined. The Virgin statue was still there, chipped and tilted at the base. Someone had tried to keep it upright with a stack of bricks, but it had slipped at some point and now leaned at a strange angle. I sat for a moment in the second pew notebook and my lap recorder in my pocket. I didn't turn it on. I just listened. There was a pressure in that space, not quite presence, not quite absence. Like a breath being held. Like something remembered that hadn't finished unfolding. I moved toward the rear wing, past the old kitchen, and into the hallway where the dormitories had been. The doors were all ajar. Most of the nameplates were missing, but one remained Sister Teresa. It was carved carefully, the letters small and exact. Across from her room was another with no name at all. It was narrower than the others, tucked beside a linen closet. I stepped inside. The bed frame was bare. The window had been boarded shut. But in the corner, half covered by a collapsed bookshelf, was a cabinet. Short, unfinished wood, one hinge cracked. I started to move it and noticed something wedged behind it, a piece of paper. Torn and brittle. I took it carefully, unfolding it like something that might crumble in my hands. The ink had faded, but it was still legible. Spanish simple phrasing, shaky handwriting. It read, "The silence is worse than fear. Obedience doesn't feel holy anymore." She told me to wait, to let them decide. But I feel something is coming. Something we won't be able to undo. I want to leave, but I promised her I'd stay. One of us has to watch. No name, no date. But it was hers. Maria's. I sat on the floor of that narrow room holding that note and tried to picture her writing it. Alone with something closing in. She had been the youngest, the one no one remembered. But she had stayed even when she wanted to run. There was one more space I hadn't explored, the storage cellar beneath the chapel. Maria had mentioned it briefly. She said it was where they were held, where Celeste sang to keep her calm. The door to the stairwell was stuck. I had to wedge my shoulder against it and push until it gave with a snap. The steps were stone slick with moisture. I turned on my flashlight and went down slowly, one hand against the wall. The air shifted the farther I descended, cooler, closer. At the bottom I found a small room, maybe 10 feet across, dirt floor, low ceiling. The remnants of rope still tied around an old post in the center. A wooden cross lay face down in the corner, half covered in debris. I didn't touch anything. I didn't need to. On the back wall, barely visible beneath a layer of grime, were 5 marks, carved crosses, each one different in size and spacing. Beneath them, in the same hand, the words, "God sees even what the church buries." I stood there for a long time, staring at those words. Then I turned off the flashlight. Let the dark settle. Not because I was brave, but because I needed to feel the silence Maria had carried for 40 years. It was thick, not empty, not dead, just buried. Back at the mission that evening, I gave her the note I'd found. She didn't ask where I got it. She didn't need to. She recognized it before she unfolded the paper. Her fingers trembled as she traced the edge. Then she placed it flat on the table and said, "That was the last thing I wrote before they came back." I asked if she'd known someone might find it. She shook her head. I just didn't want to forget how I felt before the worst of it. That night, as we sat in the garden, she asked if I would record again in the morning. "There's more," she said. "But it's not all memory. Some of it was told to me. Whispers. Things that didn't make it into the reports." I told her I would. Then I asked the question I hadn't been able to shake since I found that note. "You said you stayed for Celeste, that you made her a promise. But after everything, why didn't you leave when you had the chance?" She looked at the horizon. The sky was starting to turn. Pale pink, deep gray behind it. She said, "Because I was afraid someone would rewrite the ending. And I couldn't let that happen." I didn't speak after that. Neither of us did. The next day, she handed me something small, a folded cloth tied with twine. Inside was a rosary, olive wood, worn. On the back of the cross, scratched faintly into the metal, were the initials M.A. I left it with someone, she said. Told them to wait until someone from my family came asking. I didn't know if anyone ever would. I asked where she'd left it. She answered without looking up. "The chapel. Before I ran." It was the same one my grandmother had hidden in that trunk, the same one that brought me here. And now finally I knew why. Maria waited until the end of the week before she showed me the final folder. I think she needed time to see if I would stay, if I would keep listening, if I understood what it meant to carry something like this. We were sitting in the study again, same place where she'd first told me her name, where the light always fell through the high window at the same soft angle in the afternoon. She reached beneath a loose floorboard, pulled out a weathered envelope sealed in string, and handed it over without a word. I didn't ask how long she'd kept it hidden. I just opened it slowly, careful not to tear the edges. Inside were pages folded into thirds. Not a confession, not a diary. More like field notes, small deliberate observations, some in her handwriting, others copied from things she'd overheard. The top page was dated July 1985. She told me the mission was never officially sanctioned. That part I'd already learned. What I hadn't known was that the orphanage they were sent to assist wasn't a permanent fixture. It had been reopened quietly by a local priest who, according to Maria, had ties to someone higher up, someone in the diocesan network with influence, but not necessarily oversight. It was a favor, she said, to help him rebuild his station, maybe regain his footing after a few scandals that never made it past the region. The original building had been bombed out years earlier, left in rubble until a group of volunteers came through with cinder blocks and tin sheeting. When the 5 women arrived, they found a structure held together by prayer and scrap wood. The children were underfed, some barefoot, others too sick to speak. Celeste kept records. Maria remembered that clearly. She wrote down their names, their ages, what she could learn about where they came from, she said. She said if we didn't leave a trace of them, they'd vanish completely. By the 3rd day, Maria noticed a man watching the compound from the ridge to the south. He never approached, just stood with a pair of binoculars, shirt unbuttoned, arms folded. Celeste confronted the local priest about it. He told her to ignore it, that he was part of a village security group. But the next day, the same man appeared, closer, standing near the garden gate. The children stopped playing when they saw him. One little girl cried. On the 5th night, the sisters were in the kitchen preparing rice and beans when the first rock hit the window, then another. Then the door swung open. 3 men entered with rifles and covered faces. They ordered the sisters to kneel, told them the church was not welcome in their war. They didn't touch the children, Maria said. Not yet. They just made threats, said we were to leave by morning. Celeste asked to speak with whoever was in charge. One of the men laughed and said, "He's already watching." That night, Celeste gathered the others and held a prayer service. Maria said it was quiet. No hymns, no candles, just spoken scripture and whispered promises. She told us we weren't leaving, Maria said. That leaving meant abandoning those kids. That God doesn't step away just because the world says it's too dangerous. The next morning, the doors had been nailed shut from the outside. The raid happened after nightfall on the 8th day. Maria remembered the sound of boots against gravel, then shouting. A child screamed. She heard glass shatter. Then Sister Rosa's voice, one word. Run. But there was nowhere to run. The sisters were dragged to the chapel. Teresa had already been taken. Amalia was bleeding from the mouth. Rosa was silent. Maria and Celeste were tied together back to back in the cellar. Celeste kept humming, Maria said. Just one phrase, over and over. I didn't recognize it then. I do now. It was Psalm 69. Maria said she passed in and out of consciousness. Her head had been struck against the stone. At one point, she opened her eyes and saw the men pouring fuel into the chapel aisle, but they didn't light it. Not yet. They were waiting for someone, she said. Someone with more authority. When that man arrived midnight, maybe later everything shifted. Maria couldn't see his face, but she remembered the way the others stepped back. One called him Padre. Another said, she vouched for her. We warned her not to. The next part came slowly. Maria said Celeste begged them to let Maria go, told them she wasn't even official, that she'd made a mistake. But the man answered, "Then she dies outside the record, just like she lived." What changed that night? Maria couldn't say for sure. A storm rolled in. One of the walls buckled under the weight of wind and water. Maria's ropes loosened. Celeste was fading, her breath shallow, her speech slurred. She whispered something into Maria's ear that she's never repeated aloud, then told her to run. Maria slipped through a side door as lightning cracked over the ridge. She ran until the chapel was a flicker behind her, found the road, found someone who gave her shelter. She crossed the border under another name 2 weeks later. I asked if she ever looked back. She said no. I didn't have the right. I didn't have the name. I didn't even have proof I'd been there. I didn't speak. I just handed her the journal Father Jamie had given me, the one he'd kept all those years. She turned each page slowly. Her eyes scanned the quotes, the memos, the notes he'd written in the margins. She paused on one page near the back. The ink had smeared maybe from tears, maybe from rain. It read, "Forgive me. I couldn't carry them all." Maria closed the book gently, then looked at me with something heavier than grief, something like understanding. "I wasn't meant to be remembered," she said. But I wasn't meant to forget either. I asked her what came next, if she was ready to speak publicly. She shook her head. "Not yet, but you can." Then she reached for the cloth she'd used to wrap the rosary, folded it in half, pressed it into my hand. Inside was a second note, faded ink, same handwriting as before. But the date was different. July 18th, 1985. It said, "If someone ever comes looking, show them the stones under the altar. That's where the names are. That's where we stayed." I left the next morning just after dawn. I didn't go home. I drove to the seminary archives in San Diego, asked for maps, floor plans, blueprints, because if the names were hidden in stone, then I had to find them, before someone else buried them again. The San Diego Seminary archives sat quiet behind thick stone walls and frosted glass windows. I signed in with a student ID from my time at Loyola and a fabricated research request. The clerk didn't ask questions. Most people don't when you carry yourself like you've already been cleared to be there. I asked for structural diagrams from the 1940s through the 1970s, anything they had on the chapel and its connected buildings in El Mirador. After about 20 minutes, an older man wheeled out a rolling cart with 2 storage boxes, a binder marked Decommissioned Properties, and a yellowed folder labeled N.S. de la Paz, Renovations, 1964. That was the one I took. I spent the next 4 hours at a long wooden table in the corner of the reading room, cross-checking measurements, elevations, support beams. The altar in the chapel, according to blueprints dated 1964, was built on top of an earlier foundation, a shallow stone vault left over from a 19th century expansion. It had once stored liturgical artifacts, chalices, linens before being sealed in the 1970s. There was no formal record of what had been placed there or whether it was ever cleared. I scanned the diagrams into my laptop, marked a coordinate, and sent a quiet message to Maria, found the foundation. She didn't reply right away. 2 days later, I returned to the mission before sunrise. Maria was already awake. She was sitting in the garden, eyes closed, a mug of black coffee warming her hands. When I told her what I'd found, she didn't speak. She just nodded once, stood up, and walked with me to the chapel. The altar was heavier than it looked. 2 feet high wide at the base, hollow beneath, but sealed on all 4 sides with jointed brick and mortar. We didn't have tools, just a hand chisel from the garden shed and a crowbar I'd brought from my car. It took us 2 hours to break through. The stones gave slowly. Dust fell in soft bursts with each crack. Eventually, we opened a space wide enough to reach inside. Maria stepped back. I was the one who pulled the first object out. It was a rosary silver chain, obsidian beads, dried mud still clinging to the cross. The second item was a page from a hymnal torn at the corner edges, blackened with what looked like smoke. And then pressed flat beneath a slab of stone wrapped in wax cloth and tied with twine was a folder. Thin but sealed tightly. I opened it on the floor of the chapel while Maria watched. Inside were 6 sheets of carbon paper marked in duplicate. Not letters, not confessions, but a full roster names, assignments, mission approval details. The church's original list for the June 1985 deployment to El Mirador. On the third sheet, handwritten in the margin, was a 5th name, Maria de Los Angeles postulant, temp. Assignment not to be listed publicly. Underneath that line, someone had drawn a strike-through and scribbled, omit. Maria sat down slowly beside me, her back against the stone. That's the bishop's handwriting, she said. He signed our departure papers. We read each sheet in silence. It wasn't just a record. It was proof. Proof that she'd been there, that she'd been sent, that someone knew and chose to erase her anyway. The last page was a short memo addressed to a Father Cordova. It read, "If she returns, say nothing. No official file. No inquiry. This matter is closed." I remember closing the folder and not saying a word. I didn't need to. Maria already knew what it meant. The truth had always been there beneath stone, beneath names, beneath silence. It had waded through storms and heat and neglect, but it hadn't vanished. Later that afternoon, we sat in the study together. Maria asked if I was still writing. I told her I was, that I had scanned every sheet, logged each document, transcribed her testimony word for word. I asked if she was ready for me to release it. She didn't answer right away. Then she reached into the drawer of her desk and pulled out a photograph. The same one I'd seen weeks earlier, 5 women on a bench, Celeste at the center. Maria angled to the side. "I think it's time," she said. "But not in a headline. Not in a documentary." I nodded. "A record," I said. "Testimony." She smiled faintly. "Something that doesn't need a pulpit to be believed." That evening, I took the photo outside and scanned it again under natural light. This time, I noticed something I hadn't seen before. A child in the background, half out of frame, barefoot, watching the sisters. A rosary draped across Celeste's wrist, and scratched faintly into the stone behind the bench, a date, June 12, 1985. 3 days before they vanished. 3 days before the church closed its eyes. I sent the image to a preservation group I'd worked with once during graduate school. I didn't explain much, just labeled the file Proof Dura 1, 5th Sister. The email I got back the next morning was simple. "Is this real?" I replied. "Yes, every part." Then I opened a new document and typed a title, The 5th Sister, a true account of what the church buried. I let the cursor blink for a long time before writing the first line. In every story the church refused to tell, there was always someone watching from the edge of the frame. Behind me, I heard Maria light a candle. She didn't say a word. She didn't need to. The first outlet to pick up the story wasn't one of the big networks. It was a regional station out of Santa Fe, run by a former reporter I knew from grad school. She'd covered religious misconduct cases before, quietly, thoroughly, and she understood the weight of verification. I didn't give her everything, just the scans of the deployment order, the altar photos, and a short excerpt from Maria's statement. She ran it under the headline, The 5th Sister Unnamed Nun Linked to Forgotten Massacre. It went live at 6:17 p.m. By 7:03, it had already been pulled and replaced with a generic page not found message, but not before it was archived, reposted, and quietly mirrored by 2 watchdog forums. Within 12 hours, it was circulating in digital threads under titles like Hidden Mission Files and Church Cover-Up in El Mirador. That's when I started getting the emails. Some were from readers, curious, respectful, asking if more documents would follow. Some were from names I didn't recognize using masked addresses telling me to tread carefully. But one came with a scanned signature block that matched a Vatican legal counsel I'd seen in a different investigation years ago. It said, "Your use of church property records without authorization constitutes a violation of international archival law." No signature, no formal letterhead, just that one sentence. I forwarded it to my editor. She wrote back, "That means it's real. Keep going." In the days that followed, things moved faster than I expected. A former seminary administrator from San Bernardino came forward claiming he remembered a sister named Celeste being reassigned under duress in 1985. Then another source sent me 2 black and white photos, one of which showed 5 women standing in a courtyard identical to the photo Maria had. But this copy was labeled with numbers on the back. 1 through 5. The note read, Mur 5 not found in church registry. Never added to convent census. I called Maria to tell her. She didn't say much at first. Then she asked me to come in person. I drove out that night. The mission looked the same quiet under the moonlight, the gravel crunching under my tires as I pulled in. She met me at the chapel, her face drawn, her hands tucked into the sleeves of her sweater. They called, she said. Not local. Rome. I asked what they wanted. She shook her head. They said they were checking on my well-being. Said they heard I'd been contacted by someone digging into old wounds. She paused, then looked at me directly. They knew your name. That's when I knew we had to move. We scanned the rest of her documents that night. Every letter, every note. We triple encrypted the files, stored backups in 2 locations. By morning, Maria had made her decision. I want to speak, she said, but only once. On record. Then I go back to silence. I agreed. We filmed the interview in the study using soft lighting, no identifying markers. Just her voice. Calm, controlled. She told the full story, what she saw, what she heard, what she survived. The video went live 2 weeks later on an investigative platform that specialized in religious accountability. They handled security, they vetted the uploads, and within 48 hours, the view count passed 3 million. Public response came slowly at first. Then a statement from the local diocese was released. We are saddened by the allegations and will review any credible claims. 2 days later, another memo surfaced, this one from the Vatican's regional office. It acknowledged that record discrepancies had occurred during the civil unrest in 1985, and that one unnamed sister was unaccounted for due to administrative error. But buried at the bottom of the memo in fine print was a list of mission sites deemed too dangerous for continued presence. El Mirador was marked closed permanently. No explanation. No reference to what happened in that chapel. No mention of the raid. No mention of the children. But by then, it didn't matter. The truth was out. We began receiving letters, some from people who had once lived in El Mirador, others from former clergy who'd heard whispers over the years, but were told to stay quiet. One came from a woman in Tucson who remembered her older sister being sent to that mission briefly. She said the family never heard from her again. Her name matched one of the 4 sisters Maria had spoken about, Rosa. Lawyers reached out. Human rights groups began compiling the evidence. And then 2 months after the story broke, a forensic team was granted limited access to the chapel site under the guise of structural preservation. What they found beneath the altar was exactly what we'd documented: fragments of cloth partial records and the remains of at least 2 individuals. One of them still wore a silver cross, identical to the one Maria had hidden all those years. The official press release called it a discovery of historical significance. But we knew what it really was. Proof. Proof they'd tried to erase her. Proof they'd failed. I flew out to the mission one final time that summer. Maria was still there. The garden had grown thick with wild vines. The chapel door had been replaced. She met me at the gate, handed me a small linen bundle, and said only this: "The children deserved more. Tell them that." I nodded. I didn't cry. I just thanked her. As I drove away, I looked back once. The chapel sat quiet in the late light, its shadow long against the gravel. But inside those stones, the truth was no longer buried. It had been named, documented, heard. And for the first time in 40 years, the silence was finally broken. Sometimes when I can't sleep, I replay that first night I walked into the chapel. The hush of it. The way dust floated in the beam of my flashlight like ash in water. I remember how Maria's voice barely echoed. It was as if the stone itself was holding its breath. And I think now, maybe it always had been. Holding what they buried, holding what they tried to forget. Maria stayed in that mission house for another year, quietly. No press, no cameras. She declined every formal interview that came after the investigation, said her words were already on record, and that was enough. The forensic team finished its work and issued a final report. 3 confirmed identities, 2 partial remains, 1 still undetermined. But there was no dispute anymore, not in the church, not in the town, not in the archives. The 5th sister had existed. The massacre had happened, and someone had tried to erase both. The church issued a written statement 6 months later, carefully worded. It expressed regret over procedural failures, promised an internal review, and stated that the mission compound in El Mirador will remain closed indefinitely. They didn't use the word cover-up. They didn't mention Maria by name. But she didn't need them to. The truth was already out. And sometimes that's all that's left to work with. For me, the aftermath didn't come in a single moment. It came in quiet shifts. Letters, names added to public records, small groups who started holding remembrance services in towns that had never heard of El Mirador before. A seminary professor from Chicago wrote to say he'd added the 5th sister file to his curriculum. A retired nun in Colorado sent a card that just said, "I knew Celeste. Thank you." I read those notes when I need reminding, not that the work was finished, but that someone somewhere was listening. There are still things we'll never know. What happened during those final hours inside the mission, whether any of the children made it beyond the walls, whether someone in the higher ranks kept quiet on purpose, or just didn't want to know. Some answers are gone with the people who carried them. But what's left the record, the voice the buried remains, they speak for themselves now. I still keep the photo on my desk. The one Maria gave me, the 5 women on the bench, Celeste with that slight tilt of her head, the rosary wrapped loosely around her hand. If you look closely at the stone wall behind them, you can see it. Faint, scratched in by someone's hand, the date, the initials, and one small word in Spanish Paz. Peace. That's all she ever wanted. Not revenge, not fame, just the truth to be seen. And to make sure that no one else got left behind like she was. If this story stayed with you, share it. Say their names, light a candle. And if you've ever carried something alone, know this: even silence can break. Even buried things rise. And sometimes the quiet ones carry the loudest truth.